Welcome to week 4. After we spent a fair bit of time talking about problematic behaviors between people in terms of prejudice and discrimination, and within groups in terms of unwarranted conformity, groupthink, and so on, I'm going to focus on more positive things this week. The first part of the lecture, I want to talk about altruism and helping behavior. And then in a couple of parts about liking, attraction, and relationships. So let's start on the question of altruism. So first part to that is just thinking whether people are primarily self-interested or whether there is space for the interest of others. And it's an area where there's an interesting disconnect, I would argue, between our everyday experience, where there's lots of helping and positive interactions, and some theoretical expectations, and also some well-known stories where help was absent. And that then brings us to the question of what predicts pro-social behavior. When does it occur? When is it more likely to be lacking? And pro-social behavior here is the broadest term. In general, in social psychology, pro-social behavior is any behavior that intends to bring about some benefit for others. Why people do it doesn't matter there. It might be done just for external reward. I might engage in some helping behavior because I want to impress my partner, or I want to gain some award. So purely external motivations, as long as I also expect it to help someone else, it's pro-social behavior. More typically, we might want to think about something like benevolence. When do people actually engage in other-serving behavior without expecting external rewards? Or even we might be interested in pure altruism, where the idea is that you only have someone else's interests in mind and you don't expect any reward to yourself. Especially in philosophy, but also in lots of psychology textbooks at least, there's this discussion whether altruism, true altruism, exists. Whether people ever do things without receiving a reward and without knowing that they will receive a reward. I find it a slightly strange discussion because in my mind, good people, we would expect them to feel positive about having done something morally good. And we would expect them to be self-reflected enough to know that they will feel good about it. And then there are some moral philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, who would argue that it undermines morality. Morality requires us to do things purely wanting to benefit someone else, and that even recognizing that it will also benefit us undermines the morality of it all. I'm not convinced, and I think it's also not a very interesting empirical question. So for present purposes, I would suggest that altruistic acts, so the ones that I'm interested in this lecture, are acts that are largely motivated by wanting to benefit someone else. So they are not a show, they are not acts where I just want to appear helpful in order to be liked by some third party. That's not altruism. But I would suggest what we should be interested in are acts that are really about someone else, regardless of whether or not I'm aware that I'm going to feel good about myself afterwards. One reason why researchers are interested in studying such altruistic act is because of something that has been called the Darwinian dilemma. Charles Darwin was the scientist who started theorizing about evolution, who suggested that an implicit driver of most natural processes is the desire to pass on genes. And there's the claim that altruistic behavior may actually decrease our chances for reproducing and thereby for passing on our genes. So the question would be how pro-social behavior can be reconciled with the idea that nature, including human nature, is all about the survival of the fittest. And I think in part that question is based on a misunderstanding of Darwin. He never talked about the survival of the fittest. That term was coined by Spencer, by an economist who liked Darwin's ideas and pushed them, I would say, a fair bit further. Because what did Darwin actually have to say about pro-sociality? I'll let you read this for a moment. But basically, Darwin's key point was that if we expect people to have evolved to show the behaviors that are helpful for their survival, we would expect sympathy to be there, because the communities where people help each other are more likely to survive. So just observing behavior that we engage in for someone else's benefits isn't a puzzle that we need to work to explain. That just makes sense because it increases survival chances. So if we're trying to explain pro-social behavior, the evolutionary explanation is quite simple. So clearly, we should be expected to help those who share our genes, if we think that somehow life is about passing on those genes. And there's research that shows that the most intense helping behavior might be directed to its close biological relatives. However, even beyond those, helping is likely to establish a norm of reciprocity. If I help my neighbor, I can expect that my neighbor will help me as well, and that will build a community that's more likely to support survival. So this evolutionary angle that can explain some types of pro-social behavior. Another viewpoint is around social exchange, where researchers suggest that generally our actions have costs and benefits, and we weigh those up more or less explicitly. So this might also explain helping through contributing to a norm of reciprocity. It's a benefit for me to be able to call on my neighbor when I need help, and in order to gain that benefit, I should rather provide help. But it also explains other types of helping. I might get a nice bumper sticker for making a donation. The donation won't really hurt me. So there I have this very instrumental reason for helping. And a third distinct explanation for pro-social behavior is the theory of empathy leading to altruism, which is probably the most pleasant explanation to think of, where in some cases we actually see someone else's suffering as something that we want to reduce, that we don't like that someone else is suffering, and we really act to reduce their distress. In helping behavior, as in most other domains, there's a lot of evidence for in-group bias. In these three explanations for pro-social behavior, can each make a contribution to explaining why we are more likely to help those who are similar to us and close to us. I'm not going to elaborate that here now, to ask you to have a think about that, and then we can talk about it in class. Here I just want to raise one point that was popularized by Paul Bloom in this quite readable book, where he argued that empathy is actually problematic, that empathy shouldn't be our driver for helping behavior, because it is innumerate, because it favors the one over the many, because it takes away from rationality. What does that mean? Well, the way we can observe it is through the so-called identified victim effect, where as soon as a recipient of potential aid has a name, ideally has a picture, there's a lot more willingness to help. Sometimes to an extent that it becomes really hard to defend rationally. So this cute dog was rescued by the Animal Welfare Society in Hawaii at a cost of nearly $50,000, because his picture went viral on the media. He was lost at sea on a tanker and then Hochschild got saved. You could definitely make an argument that those $50,000 could have benefited a lot more dogs living on the streets, living in animal shelters, but they don't have a name, they don't have a picture, so they don't receive the same level of public support. Why would that be? One interesting explanation that's very cognitive would say that actually we are a lot better at evaluating proportions than at evaluating absolute numbers. So if I tell you I have this amazing development initiative where we can save 10 lives, in order for you to evaluate whether or not it's really a meaningful intervention, those researchers suggest you would want to know the reference group. Am I saving 10 lives in a village of 100? Am I saving 10 lives in a country of 100 million? To some extent, that is a rational question. It quite quickly, though, becomes irrational. If you would prefer me to save 10 out of 100 to saving 12 out of 100 million, but still proportion dominance has been widely observed. And when I'm asking you to contribute to save this one dog, then together we can save 100% of the one dog. So that might be a reason why identified victims gain a lot more support. There's also an effective explanation through empathy that it's much easier to empathize with a fully described individual. And that's supported by research that finds that one identified victim is what gets the most support. If you have even a group of identified victims, support can already drop because this human imagined, but still very human connection can't be established. The third idea is around group identity. But if you think back to week 1, we talked about concentric selves. The idea that we share identities in groups, and people who are very remote are sometimes only seen in terms of that very remote identity. So it's seen as part of this huge group of poor people in Asia that I don't feel any close connection with. But as soon as they get a name, some research has shown them to become more fully human. And that then bridges intergroup distance. So that might be one other explanation for this identifiable victim effect. However, it's a big part of a phenomenon that's called compassion fade. That just means that larger groups of people in need often trigger smaller donations, or at least that greater need doesn't lead to greater helping in this remote context where people are giving money or other resources. And it's a problem because it appears to contradict morals and logic, more people in need should trigger a greater willingness to help. It also contradicts what people predict of themselves. So when you ask them, do you think you would give more if more people needed help? Most people say yes. If we then test them on it, most people are not influenced by the number. And that's called scope insensitivity, or for that matter by Paul Bloom in his Against Empathy book, innumeracy. We are just not affected by numbers, especially when the numbers are quite large. So one of the early studies in this field asked people for their desire to support environmental campaigns that would save 2,000 birds or 200,000 birds. It's a factor of 100 in between. There's a big difference between those campaigns. And still, people responding to them individually had exactly the same response. So those numbers on their own didn't seem to have much meaning. One intervention social psychologists have come up with to support fundraising in such situations is called unit asking. And the idea there is to really split those two questions. The question of what kind of help does the individual need, and how do we now deal with a large number? The fundraisers engaging in unit asking would say, well, look at this person, or let me tell you about a person who is in a certain situation. There's been this environmental disaster, the house has been swept away. How should they be helped? How much would that be worth? And then, once people have suggested how much that would be worth to them, fundraisers go to the scale of the problem. And so there's not one such person, there are 10,000 such people. And of course, most potential donors now don't have the money to say, well, I would have said that family needs $500 support. Now I give you those $500 for everyone affected. But if you do it in those two steps, people have a desire to be consistent and say, well, I said one unit of support was worth that much. So at least I think you should be able to raise this big amount of money, and I'll contribute as much as I can. Just an example for how you can use some of this research to improve the way people promote helping, in this case, charitable giving. But moving away from this long distance helping towards something much closer, I want to talk about bystander behavior. Bystander behavior is just about situations where people are present when there is a stranger in distress and they could help, or they could stand by and do nothing. And research into this was prompted by some sensational stories and interesting early pieces of research. The most famous story is that of Kitty Genovese, a young woman who was murdered in New York, and where especially the newspapers then described her as being murdered in front of her neighbors' eyes, where more than 20 neighbors were said to have watched, chatted to each other, but not even bothered to call the police. That story is not true. Most modern psychology textbooks give the correct facts that were not at all as shocking as the story was told at the time. But this provided a lot of motivation for people to study bystander behavior. So when would bystanders help, and when would they just stand by? An early interesting study in that was the Good Samaritan study that was run in a seminary, so in a priest training school. And there, Darley and Batson designed quite a clever experiment. They got participants into a room and told them, you need to prepare a little lecture on one of two topics, either the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is basically Jesus emphasizing how important it is to help strangers in need, or some less relevant topic was something around employment. You have to develop this lecture, prepare yourself to give this little lecture. and then they sent them across campus to a lecture theater to actually speak. And the experiment happened on the way. On the way, there was an actor lying on the ground in distress. So that was the opportunity to intervene as a bystander. However, sometimes the researchers told their participants to really hurry up, that you're late for the lecture, really you need to make your way there quickly. Sometimes they just sent them across leisurely. So what happened? They were testing two effects. One was, does being in a hurry make a difference? And clearly it did. Participants who weren't in a hurry on the left-hand side of the chart, on average, helped much more than people who were in a hurry. Green and yellow are the two topics. There, the researchers concluded there was no difference between the two topics. If you look at this chart, you might be surprised by that conclusion. I'll get to that in a moment. But let's firstly have a quick look at what the y-axis represents. That's also always a helpful thing to look at when you see an impressive looking chart. So how did they measure helping behavior? Well, they quite understandably came up with a list of things bystanders could feasibly do. They could fail to notice the victim, they could help in various ways, and they could help a lot. They could stay with the victim and say, well, forget about the lecture. Then they ordered these behaviors by intensity of helping, assigned them numbers, and then started to calculate averages. And that's where I think it becomes very dubious, where when you read such research, you should just think whether that method makes sense to you. So say you have one group where one person fails to notice the victim, just is absent-minded and walks by, and the other person helps indirectly. So if those two people, in the other group, you have two people who see that the person is in distress and just decide to ignore it. Now, both these groups have an average value of 1 on this scale. Are they helping to the same extent? And my reaction would be clearly not. Clearly two very different patterns of behavior in these two groups. So maybe not a great outcome measure here. Also, why did they conclude there was no difference between the lectures, even though the green bars were always higher than the yellow bars in the chart, suggesting that regardless of the level of hurry, actually people going to talk about the Good Samaritan were more likely to help. Well, statistics. And clearly we can't just observe some data and then say, well, because that was the case in this one sample of a couple of students, this is a true effect in the world. So what significance testing is about is considering whether it would have been very unlikely to see that effect if it was just due to chance. So here they concluded we can't be sure that it's not due to chance. However, not being sure that there is an effect really doesn't mean being sure that there is no effect. And in fairness, their original paper doesn't state this as strongly as many later textbooks stated. Many later textbooks say, well, the lecture topic didn't matter. That is not true. Their data didn't allow us to conclude that the lecture topic mattered. Based on modern standards of evidence, their sample was just far too small. They only had 40 participants across 6 different groups. Today, you would probably want 40 participants in each of the groups. But even on their data, you can tell a different story, in that case using a different type of statistics. You don't need to learn about this in detail anytime soon. But there is this idea of Bayesian statistics, which is all about assigning relative probabilities, but saying, well, we don't know whether it makes a difference or not. It doesn't make so much sense to have this binary decision. it just makes more sense to really try to calculate the odds and say, what should we probabilistically believe? And Greenwald, quite a well-known psychologist, responded to the initial research very early on and said, well, actually, your data shows that we have a 5-to-1 probability that the lecture topic did make a substantial difference. Whether we now believe that this 5 in 1, so 80% chances, actually a bit more than 80% even, 5-to-1, whether we believe that that's good enough to do anything with it is our decision. But it seems to be the fairer way to describe the study. So maybe it actually does help to get people to think about the importance of helping. At least the study does not provide evidence that it doesn't help to do so. Thinking about why bystanders don't help requires us to think about the process that might lead to helping. Because different things can go wrong and they require a different diagnosis. And so we can just completely miss the incident. Now, regardless of how committed we are to helping, we walk through a busy city and have things to do, we'll not notice everything that's going on, right? So attention is the first step. If we don't notice something, we can't help. Next step is around appraisal. So does this situation constitute an emergency? Does someone need help? Has someone just passed out in the park, or are they having a nap? Often it's clear, sometimes it's legitimately unclear whether someone needs help. Is that just how they talk to each other in that relationship? Or is someone being abused here in a way where it would be good to intervene? So this appraisal. And then the third question is, do I assume responsibility for helping? And I might do that because I think it's my specific role here. If we were having an in-person lecture, 2 of you started a fight, clearly I would see it as my role as some kind of authority figure to intervene. But there are also lots of other reasons why you would assume that role. It might be about your morality, it might be about your relationship to someone in the situation and so on. And this is what is often studied, and where the conclusion is often drawn that people just don't care and aren't assuming responsibility, which might be true, but it's important not to forget those earlier steps. So if we don't notice something and we don't see it as an emergency, we can't really take responsibility to help. Only when those 3 things happen, then action can occur. So do they happen? When do they happen? The strongest conclusion from the research, or general pattern from the research, is what's often just called the bystander effect. It's in fact the multiple bystander effect. And the finding is that quite often, when you have more people present, there will be less helping overall. Why would that be? A couple of reasons. Just go straight back to the crew processes we talked about last week. So there is this diffusion of responsibility. Why should I do it when there are 50 other people who can do it as well? Because we could do it together, but that would need a lot of coordination. And maybe I can just leave it to someone else. So this diffusion of responsibility at a more fundamental level might just be a combination of free rider and social loafing effects. Then there's the tendency to conform. If there is a group and no one reacts, that quickly comes to be perceived as the right thing to do in that situation. And often it's perceived as the right thing to do because of what's called pluralistic ignorance. Because especially in ambiguous situations, we might just look around to other people and try to gain information from them. Is this how people here deal with their disagreements? Or is this a level of violence and aggression where we should intervene? is this a person who is facing a medical issue? Or is it just a person who has had a few too many and they will make their way home all right? And often no one knows. But we come to think that other people somehow know the right behavior, so we just look at them and copy their behavior. There's some interesting research into how long it takes for this effect to emerge. And that suggests that if someone intervenes in the first couple of seconds, it's basically no bystander effect. If no one intervenes then, and everyone first gets a chance to look around and see that other people don't act, you quickly get to this norm of non-action being set, partly because everyone thinks that others have a reason for reasonably deciding that no action is needed. However, this is not always the case. There's a good, fairly recent meta-analysis that suggests that the bystander effect is much reduced in situations that are unambiguous, where help is clearly needed. Because there you have no informational influence. It's basically thinking back to Ash's line studies, when the lines have clearly unequal length. There's still a desire to conform, but it's much weaker than when the lines are really hard to tell apart. So when the situation is clear, people are more likely to intervene regardless of bystanders. And also, it's important not to forget to look at base rates. So even if it's true that there's less helping, if it was true that there's less helping if there are more people, a question we're probably all interested in is what this recent article addressed: will I be helped? And they looked at CCTV, public CCTV data from a couple of countries and found that bystanders usually intervene, and in fact in their data, more bystanders tended to provide more help. Probably because what they defined as a conflict was quite an obvious situation where help would be welcome. But it's important to be aware of that baseline. Maybe also try to explain where that comes from and how that default response can actually be strengthened rather than just explaining problematic exceptions. Because that's again a point that I already made in week 2 about the power of social norms. If we can emphasize existing social norms, that often makes it much easier to reinforce behaviors, to change minority behavior. And there's some interesting developmental psychology research around how helping can be a true identity, how you can raise helpers who internalize pro-social behavior as just a thing to do. Another aspect is around choosing the stories we tell. For every kid DeGeneres, there are many stories of people saving their life to help others. Which of those do we tell? Because the stories that we tell are seen, availability heuristic, right? Are seen as representing the normal behavior. And the normal behavior, based on the CCTV data and much other evidence, is helping. So only telling the other stories distorts reality. Setting expectations can also happen through law. Quite a few countries have duty to rescue laws, for example, Germany and Spain, where you have a legal obligation to help a stranger in need. You don't need to do much based on the law, but at least you need to call an ambulance. If you just walk past, you can be prosecuted. And that's a very clear expression of a social norm to help strangers in need. Lots of interesting debates whether or not that's a good idea for legal and moral reasons, but it's something to consider regarding norm setting. And of course, you can structure altruism and helping in clever ways. So one example I just briefly want to share are organ donation chains, where few people are willing to just donate one of their kidneys to a stranger. Some people are willing to do that, and I think it's an admirable act of altruism. But one way to use those acts of altruism most effectively is to think about how to build systems that tap into people's more parochial altruism. Because if someone needs a kidney, they quite often find a family member or a friend who is willing to donate one. But typically, those don't match, because you need to match in blood type. So something that has been designed very successfully are donor chains, where one altruistic donor starts a chain and others can receive a kidney if one of their friends or family members donates. And so the chain goes on. Some of these chains have led to 30 people getting a transplant who might otherwise not have had. The median length in one published study was 6 transplants per initial donor, per altruistic donor. So another thing where we can recognize that there is some level of altruism there and then think about what are the kind of systems and reactions to that to make it most effective. And I want to conclude with looking at the personal impact of helping. Because it's not just the right thing to do, but there's lots of research that suggests that it brings individual level benefits. So people who help others experience greater self-worth, greater well-being, greater longevity, less mortality, and unsurprisingly, greater reputation and prestige. And this benefit of helping on the individual level has come to be used in both clinical psychology and in positive psychology interventions to increase people's well-being. For one, in the form of loving kindness meditation, it's more about imagined helping and in encouraging random and less random acts of kindness. I would encourage you to give either of those a go, so have a look at the instructions below the video. And after that, I'll see you back for the next part that's about interpersonal liking and attraction.